Hello, I'm Gokul and welcome to the channel. Today we'll be discussing the hippocampus. The hippocampus is found in the temporal lobe below the cerebral cortex. Although we often refer to it in the singular, there are actually two hippocampi, one in each cerebral hemisphere. The term hippocampus comes from the Greek word for seahorse because when it's removed from the brain, the hippocampus is said to vaguely resemble a seahorse. The hippocampus is a brain structure thought to play a critical role in memory. Although suspected to be involved with memory for some time, the importance of the hippocampus in this respect was solidified in the 20th century by the case of a patient named Henry Malazan. Malazan, who was known simply as HM until his death in 2008 to preserve his anonymity when he was still alive, underwent surgery to treat severe epilepsy in his late 20s. In that surgery, much of his hippocampi were either removed or damaged by the surgeons. The surgery, however, was successful in controlling Malazan's seizures, but afterwards he suffered from severe anterograde amnesia, meaning that his ability to form new memories was impaired. In fact, HM was completely unable to form new explicit memories. Explicit memories are memories that involve conscious recollection of facts or experiences. HM retained some memories from before the surgery, although memories that were closer in time to his surgery were less stable, and his procedural memory, which is the memory for non-conscious procedures like using a fork or riding a bike, was still functional. But due to his deficits in implicit memory, HM was forced to live entirely in the present world. Each day brought with it no recollection of the day before. Another interesting patient case named Clive Waring experienced hippocampal damage after suffering from encephalitis and is living with a deficit very similar to HM. He's only able to retain information for about 30 seconds before it disappears, but he can still utilize procedural memory to do things like play the piano and ride his bike. Thus, the hippocampus is thought to be a crucial structure in memory consolidation and also the formation of new memories. The hippocampus is also one of the brain regions most affected by Alzheimer's disease, which is a neurodegenerative disorder and a debilitating illness that is characterized by severe memory loss. Alzheimer's disease involves neurodegeneration, or the deterioration and death of neurons. While this damage to the neurons is widespread across the brain, neurons in the hippocampus are particularly susceptible to Alzheimer's. The hippocampus is also thought to be important to spatial navigation and orientation. It's been hypothesized that neurons in the hippocampus encode information about our environment in such a way that they create a cognitive map about our surroundings. One well-known study investigated this hypothesis by looking at the brains of a group who are required to have refined navigation skills, cab drivers or black cab drivers in London. Researchers used MRI technology to compare the size of the hippocampi in London cabbies to the size of the hippocampi in control subjects. They found that the cab drivers had increased gray matter volume in the hippocampi, suggesting that perhaps the cabbies had formed a larger number of neuronal connections, while creating a more complex cognitive map in their hippocampi. The hippocampi has many other roles beyond memory and navigation. For example, reduced hippocampal volume has been seen in depressed patients and those suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. It is thought that the stress experienced by patients who suffer from these disorders may be especially damaging to hippocampal neurons, but memory remains the function most associated with the hippocampus, in part due to fascinating cases like HM and Clive Waring. Now let's get to the anatomy of the hippocampus. The hippocampus is part of a larger structure in the temporal lobe called the hippocampal formation. Definitions of what structures are included in the hippocampal formation vary, but generally the hippocampal formation is considered to be made out of at least the hippocampus, the adjacent cortex, which is called the hippocampal or parahippocampal gyrus, and a strip of gray matter in between the two called the dentate gyrus. The hippocampal gyrus contains areas such as the entorhinal cortex and the subiculum, which are both involved in the flow of information throughout the hippocampus. In addition to being compared to a seahorse, the hippocampus has also been likened to the curved horn of a ram, or the horns of the ancient Egyptian god of Ammon, and thus has been called Ammon's horn or cornu ammonis. Accordingly, the hippocampus has been subdivided anatomically into four regions, designated CA1 through CA4. The CA stands for cornu ammonis. The hippocampus receives information from the rest of the cerebral cortex, primarily via the perforant pathway, which originates in the entorhinal cortex and projects into the dentate gyrus. Via the mossy fiber pathway, fibers then leave the dentate gyrus and project to neurons in the CA3 region of the hippocampus. Then via the Schaefer collateral pathway, neurons in the CA3 region in the hippocampus then send axons to neurons in the CA1 region of the hippocampus, which then project to neurons in the subiculum. The subiculum can be considered the main output region for the hippocampal formation. Fibers from the subiculum project back upon neurons in the entorhinal cortex, and then fibers from the entorhinal cortex travel out to a variety of areas in the cerebrum. Output fibers also leave the subiculum and hippocampus and enter the fornix. The fornix is a fiber bundle that connects the hippocampus with a variety of subcortical areas, such as the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And so, to summarize, the main input of the hippocampus is the entorhinal cortex, and the main output region of the hippocampus is the subiculum. Thank you for listening.